The night carried a peculiar stillness, as if the world held its breath. Inside a modest home in Denver, the clock ticked louder than usual, and Mark sat at the kitchen table, his calloused hands cradling a mug of coffee gone cold. The shadows danced around him, their shapes whispering doubts he wasn't ready to confront. On the counter, her suitcase lay open, its contents meticulous and deliberate, except for one thing, those pills. Pills that didn't belong in a life they had built together. It wasn't suspicion that gripped him, it was certainty. Certainty that something fragile had cracked, a crack Olivia seemed determined to ignore. He followed her to Seattle, telling himself it was to understand, not to accuse. But as he stood outside that restaurant, the rain streaking the windows, he saw her. She wasn't the Olivia he thought he knew. Her laughter with another man was like glass shattering inside him, the shards cutting deeper with every second. The hotel key in his hand felt heavier now, weighted with betrayal and rage. And when he entered her room later that night, the silence begged him to leave everything as it was. Instead, he took everything, her belongings, her work, her stability, and left behind only a void. Portland had given Mark a second chance, but the scars from Denver refused to fade. He had rebuilt his life with grease-stained hands and quiet determination, yet the past haunted him in moments of stillness. Emily and Ethan, his lifeline to what once was, drifted further with each phone call cut short and visit delayed. The knock on his garage door that day wasn't just unexpected, it was unwelcome. Benjamin and Claire, strangers with a story too impossible to ignore, unraveled the threads of his fragile new life. A daughter? His? Their words clawed at wounds he thought he'd buried. And then came the name, Olivia. The Florida sun didn't warm the room where Olivia sat, frail but defiant. Mark's anger dissolved into something he couldn't name as he looked at her. Sickness had stolen the woman he once loved, leaving behind someone who wore regret like a second skin. "You should hate me," she whispered, her voice brittle. "But I didn't tell you because I was afraid you'd walk away again." Her words struck him harder than the betrayal ever had. And as he stared at the daughter he'd never met, asleep in a hospital bed, Mark realized this wasn't about forgiveness, it was about saving what little could still be saved. The courthouse steps were crowded, the air thick with whispers and accusations. William, polished and powerful, looked every bit the untouchable man he believed himself to be. But this time, his secrets wouldn't stay buried. Mark's voice trembled as he spoke, not with fear but with the weight of truth. "You don't have to care about me, or Olivia, but you will care about her. Because if you don't, the world will know exactly who you are." The politician flinched, not from Mark's words, but from the reality he could no longer control. And for the first time, Mark felt something he hadn't in years, hope. The hospital room was quiet, save for the soft beeping of machines and the occasional shuffle of footsteps. Mark stood at the foot of his daughter's bed, Emily and Ethan by his side. Their fragmented family was far from perfect, but in that moment, it was enough. As he watched her chest rise and fall with the promise of life, he glanced at Olivia, her frailty a stark reminder of how little time they had left. "You think it's too late?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then shook his head. "For her? No. For us, maybe not." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in a warm, forgiving glow, Mark finally allowed himself to believe in second chances. How far would you go to make amends? To right the wrongs of the past, even when forgiveness feels impossible? Maybe it's not about forgetting, but about choosing to carry the weight together. Because in the end, it's not the scars that define us, it's what we do with them. It was the kind of morning that promised no surprises, the kind where routines hummed steadily like a well-tuned engine. But beneath the veneer of normalcy, there was tension, a tension that only Mark seemed to notice. Olivia's movements were precise, almost surgical, as she laid out her wardrobe for the trip. Her eyes, sharp and focused, flicked over the checklist she kept in her mind, a list he would never fully understand. To her, this trip was everything, an opportunity, a stepping stone, perhaps even salvation from the quiet life she had outgrown. Mark admired her from across the room, as he always had, though now there was a distance between them that neither acknowledged aloud. She was a symphony of ambition, a crescendo that seemed to grow louder with each passing year. He told himself he was proud of her drive, but pride had a way of masking deeper truths. Olivia was leaving, not just for Seattle, but in every other way that mattered. And Mark was the only one still pretending otherwise. The bag was open, its contents spilled casually on the bed, a collection of items that spoke to a life he thought he knew. There was her neatly packed planner, her favorite pen, the scent of lavender lingering on a scarf she always wore in colder weather. But among these familiar things was something that didn't belong, a blister pack of pills. It was such a small object, unassuming in its design, but it carried the weight of something irreversible. Mark stared at it, the room around him blurring into a haze of disbelief. The pills didn't belong to him, they couldn't. A single question began to echo in his mind, louder and more insistent with every passing moment. Why? He sat on the edge of the bed, his hands trembling as they held the tiny package. Memories rushed in unbidden, his decision to get a vasectomy, the relief they had shared, the unspoken understanding that their family was complete. And yet, here was this artifact of possibility, this symbol of a choice made without him. It wasn't just the pills, it was what they represented, a chasm between them that he hadn't seen until now. He waited until the kids were asleep, until the house was wrapped in the kind of silence that amplifies every word, every breath. Olivia's face betrayed nothing when he placed the pills on the table between them. She looked at them, then at him, her expression a mask of calm that infuriated him more than any outburst could have. Her explanation came easily, too easily. They weren't hers, she said, a dismissive wave of her hand, as though that would be enough to erase the weight of his discovery. They belonged to a friend, a colleague, someone she didn't name but apparently trusted enough to hold their secrets. Mark didn't believe her, not entirely, not in the way he had once believed every word that left her lips. There was a tremor in her voice, a slight hesitation that gave her away. But he said nothing, not then. He let her words hang in the air between them, each one a thread in the web of doubt that had begun to entangle him. By the time she left for Seattle the next morning, the air between them was heavy with unspoken accusations and unanswered questions. Mark watched her go, his heart a knot of anger and sorrow, knowing that the truth was slipping further away with every step she took. The road to Seattle stretched out before him, a ribbon of asphalt that felt both endless and necessary. Mark didn't make the decision to follow her lightly. It was as though some unseen force compelled him, a whisper in the back of his mind that refused to be ignored. He needed to see it for himself, to confirm what his heart already suspected but his mind refused to accept. When he arrived at the restaurant, he stayed in the shadows, the voyeur to a life he no longer recognized. Olivia sat across from a man he had never seen before, their laughter a melody that grated against his nerves. She was radiant in a way that felt foreign to him, as though this version of her had never belonged in their shared life. Every moment he watched was another knife in his chest, every smile and every lingering glance between them a betrayal that burned deeper than he thought possible. Mark wanted to burst through the doors, to demand answers, to make her see the wreckage she had left behind. But he stayed where he was, frozen by the weight of his discovery and the realization that the woman he loved was a stranger to him now. Rage has a way of sharpening the mind, of turning grief into something almost tangible. Mark waited until the hotel was quiet, until the night had settled into that eerie stillness that makes even the smallest sounds echo. When he entered Olivia's room, he was struck by how perfectly it mirrored her, impeccable, calculated, devoid of any warmth that wasn't curated. He moved through the space like a ghost, touching the things she had brought with her, her laptop, her sketches, the meticulously organized portfolio that was the cornerstone of her presentation. He took it all. Every last thing that tethered her to this moment of success, this life she had chosen over him. It wasn't just revenge, it was a declaration, a way of saying, you don't get to leave without consequences. As he drove away from the hotel, her belongings piled in the back seat, Mark felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. But beneath it was something darker, a hollow space where hope had once lived. He wasn't just running from her betrayal, he was running from the man he had become because of it. Portland had given Mark a semblance of peace, but peace is a fragile thing. It exists not in the absence of chaos, but in the spaces we carve out amidst the noise. For 5 years, Mark had worked tirelessly, his days filled with the hum of engines and the scent of motor oil. His garage became more than a workplace, it was a sanctuary, a place where every wrench twist and engine tune drowned out the echoes of a past he refused to revisit. But even the loudest engines couldn't silence the void left by his children. Emily and Ethan were voices on a phone line now, their laughter distant, their struggles muffled by the miles that separated them. Mark tried to tell himself that the separation was necessary, that the distance gave them the stability he couldn't provide. But late at night, when the garage lights dimmed and the stillness returned, the guilt crept in like a shadow, whispering of opportunities missed and moments lost forever. In his solitude, Mark found a routine. The monotony became a balm, a way to keep the wounds from reopening. But peace, as Mark would soon learn, has a way of shattering when we least expect it. The knock on the garage door came with a sense of finality, as though it carried the weight of everything Mark had been avoiding. He didn't recognize the couple at first, Benjamin and Claire, well-dressed but weary, their eyes heavy with a burden they were desperate to share. They spoke carefully, their words measured and deliberate, each one chipping away at the walls Mark had built around himself. A child. His child. The revelation struck like a thunderclap, scattering the pieces of his carefully constructed life. The girl, they said, was sick in a way that only he could remedy. Mark didn't respond at first. How could he? Their words hung in the air, a puzzle he couldn't piece together. 5 years of silence, of moving forward, of leaving the past behind, and now, the past had found him, demanding answers he wasn't prepared to give. Benjamin and Claire didn't press him. They left behind a photo, a face so innocent and unfamiliar that it broke something deep within him. And as the door closed behind them, Mark found himself staring at the image, his mind a storm of anger, confusion, and something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Mark spent the next few days in a haze, his thoughts circling like vultures over a carcass. A daughter. His daughter. The idea felt impossible, yet the evidence was irrefutable. Her eyes, the curve of her smile, they were fragments of himself reflected in a life he'd never known existed. But with the revelation came questions, each one more painful than the last. Why hadn't Olivia told him? Had she known? Or was this another secret buried in the rubble of their failed marriage? And what right did he have to step into this child's life now, as a stranger, as a savior? The responsibility weighed on him, an anchor pulling him into the depths of his own inadequacies. He wasn't the hero this girl deserved. He was a man running from his failures, a father who had already failed 2 children. But the guilt of inaction was a heavier burden still. As the days passed, Mark found himself returning to the photo. He studied every detail, searching for answers in the features that mirrored his own. In her, he saw a second chance, a chance to do right by someone who had no say in the chaos that brought her into the world. But redemption, he knew, would come at a cost. The phone call came late one evening, its timing as disruptive as the message it delivered. Olivia was sick. The words were spoken plainly, without embellishment, yet they carried an impact that left Mark breathless. She was the girl's mother, they said, the connection he hadn't dared to consider, now laid bare before him. Mark's initial reaction was anger, a wave of fury that surged against the dam of his self-control. Of course, it was Olivia. Who else could it be? The betrayal felt fresh again, as though the years between them had dissolved in an instant. But beneath the anger was something softer, something he refused to name. Pity, perhaps, or empathy for the woman who had once been his world. She was a mother now, fighting a battle that was hers alone. The irony wasn't lost on him. Olivia, the architect of so much pain, now reduced to vulnerability, reliant on the man she had betrayed. Mark didn't sleep that night. He sat in the dim light of his garage, the photo of the girl on the table before him. The decision wasn't simple. It wasn't just about her. It was about him, about the man he wanted to be, the father he had failed to become. The past and present collided in those quiet hours, and for the first time in years, Mark felt the stirrings of purpose. But purpose, he knew, would demand something he wasn't sure he could give. Forgiveness. Not just for Olivia, but for himself. The flight to Pensacola felt like a descent into memory, each mile bringing him closer to a version of himself he had tried to bury. The sunlight there was harsh, casting every flaw, every truth, into sharp relief. Olivia's home was nothing like the life they had once shared, modest, subdued, stripped of the grandiosity that had defined her ambition. It was as if her illness had consumed more than her health. It had taken her identity, leaving behind only regret. Mark had rehearsed this moment in his mind, each iteration more confrontational than the last. But when he saw her, frail and diminished, the anger that had sustained him for so long wavered. Olivia wasn't the woman he had hated. She was something smaller now, almost unrecognizable. Her voice, when she spoke, was a whisper of its former self, each word a fragile thread woven with remorse. She didn't defend herself. She didn't justify the choices that had led them to this point. Instead, she offered him the one thing she never had before: vulnerability. But vulnerability wasn't enough to erase the scars she had left behind. Mark wanted answers, he needed them. And as Olivia recounted the years they had spent apart, the truth emerged in pieces, each one heavier than the last. The child wasn't his, not biologically. She was the result of a fleeting affair with a man Olivia barely dared to name. But the child's need, her life, was real. And so was the choice before him. The name she finally spoke came as no surprise: William. A name Mark had heard in whispers during their marriage, a man whose presence had loomed like a shadow over their final days together. William was power incarnate, a politician whose carefully curated image hid the cracks in his integrity. He was the kind of man who believed he could rewrite reality with the stroke of a pen. Olivia's refusal to confront him wasn't born of fear for herself, but for their daughter. She had built a life of silence to protect her child from the fallout of William's wrath. Mark saw the logic in her caution, but he also saw the flaw. Silence wouldn't save their daughter, it would only ensure her suffering. And so, Mark made the decision Olivia couldn't. He wouldn't let William hide behind his wealth and influence. He wouldn't let the man who had shattered his family escape the consequences of his action. Mark's determination wasn't fueled by revenge, it was something deeper, something purer. It was the fierce love of a father, not by blood but by choice. William's office was a fortress, a monument to his success and a reminder of the power he wielded. But Mark wasn't there to be intimidated. He carried with him not just the weight of his own pain, but the hope of a child who didn't even know his name. The meeting was brief, explosive in its intensity. William's denial was swift, his dismissiveness cutting, but Mark had come prepared. He didn't bring threats, he brought truth. Photos, letters, documents Olivia had kept hidden for years, now laid bare for the man who had tried to erase them. William's facade cracked, but not in the way Mark had hoped. There was no remorse, no admission of guilt. Instead, there was calculation, a cold and clinical assessment of the damage Mark could inflict. William wasn't a man who broke under pressure, he was a man who thrived in it. And yet, for all his bluster, William underestimated the one thing Mark had that he didn't, the unwavering support of those who loved the child he had abandoned. Benjamin and Claire, silent but steadfast, joined Mark in his stand. Their unity was a force William hadn't anticipated, a reminder that some battles couldn't be won with money and influence alone. In the end, it wasn't William's conscience that brought him to the hospital. It was the weight of public scrutiny, the whispers of scandal that threatened to unravel his carefully constructed image. Mark didn't care why William agreed to the transplant. All that mattered was the girl lying in that hospital bed, her life hanging in the balance. The procedure was a success, but the victory was bittersweet. Olivia's condition had worsened, her body succumbing to the illness she had fought so valiantly to hide. Mark stayed by her side, the animosity between them softened by the shared love for the child they had both failed in different ways. In her final days, Olivia spoke of forgiveness, not for herself but for Mark. She asked him to forgive the past, to find peace in the future he had been given. And though Mark couldn't bring himself to say the words, he felt their truth settle in his heart. Forgiveness wasn't about absolution, it was about release. Mark's first visit to the hospital after the transplant was tentative, his steps hesitant as he approached the room where his daughter lay. She was awake, her small frame dwarfed by the machines that surrounded her. But her eyes, bright and curious, held none of the pain he had expected. Emily and Ethan joined him, their presence a reminder of the family they had once been and the one they could become. They sat together, strangers bound by blood and love, their differences eclipsed by the moment they shared. Mark didn't know what the future would hold. He didn't know if he could be the father his daughter deserved or if the wounds of the past would ever fully heal. But for the first time in years, he felt something close to hope. And hope, he realized, was enough. The sun rose over the hospital, casting the room in a golden light that felt almost divine. Mark stood at the window, his thoughts a mixture of grief and gratitude. Olivia was gone, her absence a void that would take time to fill. But her legacy lived on in the child they had saved, in the family that had been pieced back together from the fragments of their broken lives. As he turned to face the room, he saw not just his children but the possibility of a future he had once thought impossible. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past, it was about building something stronger from its ruins. And in that moment, Mark knew they would find a way forward, together.